but I really want to get at some of the nuance of it tonight. Like what actually makes it distinct and maybe dangerous. I'm curious what sort of things y'all could say about maybe the origins of like this organized purity culture.
I don't
When
know
you
who
say
wants to go first, Alice, you or me. I'll let you take it.
well, first of all, a little clarity. When you say
Yeah.
organized purity culture, are you talking about the movement that sort of kind of got a fresh wind in the late 90s and carried over into the early 2000s?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair to say. We did a episode a couple of years back with Dr. Daryl Ray where we talked about, everything from the moral majority through like I Kiss Dating Goodbye. And I think that those roots are obviously distinct from just the same old, well, the Bible says. But there was like a really huge push that I think maybe you could say started in the 80s. Maybe you could trace it back even further. I don't know. How would y'all define it?
I think for myself, when I look at it, like I know in my lifetime, I'm 36 years old and I was 12, I believe, 11 or 12 when Joshua Harris's I Kiss Dating Goodbye came out. So I was right at the age where I was beginning to think about dating. So that's in my personal life, that's where I trace it to. But I do think that his book was born out of, some very fertile soil.
Mhm.
And I don't know, I suppose on the spot thinking about it, I think I would personally, just throwing it out there, trace it to a backlash to the hippie movement that maybe my parents' generation was a part of, and to the Jesus freak movement that also sprung up alongside that. So
Mhm.
the late 60s, early 70s, sort of Christian Jesus hippie, like a make love not war type of thing. I think that there was, while in some senses sexuality was being liberated in the United States as we know it today as never before in the history of just the United States, I think that there's an understandable backlash to that. And I think that by the time that those people who may or may not have partook in the sheer hedonism and fun of that subculture, I think that they probably wanted to instill their children with different values for different reasons. But I do think that I observe that modesty, uh, it's very pendular. So like we think of the Victorian era as a very, buttoned up, chaperoned, sort of chaste era. But like before that, in like the colonial era, which we could also say is pretty buttoned up, they had what's it called, bundling. Teenagers would be allowed to spend the night together in bed, and the boy would be stitched up in like a cloth sleeping bag, and women in other parts of the world would dab in the early 1800s. So fashion, and I can nerd out on vintage fashion, so bear with me. I'll try to keep this short. In the early 1800s, women's fashion in the Western world went from being very tightly corseted to very loose, and partly that was to hide unmarried pregnancies. The empire waistlines were very high and came to just under the bust, and it was very common to like dab a wet cloth on the sheer white fabric that would be on top of a corset, so that a woman's breasts would be, sort of teasing through that. And then we swung hard the other way, where we see the more Edwardian buttoned up high collar of the early 1900s school marm look. And then we see the 1920s flapper look. So to my observation, I think sexuality, flagrancy, and modesty have always kind of been doing this little dance generation to generation. And so
Mhm.
I think that by the time I came of age, in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was pretty ripe for a movement like the evangelical purity culture movement that we see today. And I think that, one could argue that, oh no, that's when like even more sexual liberation was happening and girls' skirts were getting shorter. I think both these things can be true and have been true observably throughout Western history. But that's my very long-winded answer to your question.
No, I love it. I
Feel
certainly
free to
relate.
anytime rein me in
Yeah,
on
no,
track.
no, no. I'll say that for me, purity culture definitely started when my dad gave the girl I had a crush on a copy of I Kiss Dating Goodbye, which just
Mm,
tanked my dating life for the next, I don't know, 30 years. We'll get into it later.
wow.
Uh, But Seth, I'd love to hear your thoughts on I guess sort of the origins here, but more in particular, I'm very curious from you if it's fair to say that this is a like organized political movement with a particular agenda, or if this is something that's a little bit more grassroots, something more of like a natural social movement, the way that maybe Alice is suggesting.
I think it's a very complex tapestry. First of all, Alice, I think better than I could have, really spoke to, I think it's kind of a sine wave. It's cyclical.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the 20th century, you know, it's funny. I'm producing a new podcast just about true stories at truestoriespodcast.com. Quick slug for that. But I have a story coming up about a woman who was scheduled to appear in court as a witness to a crime, and the judge sent her home. And when she refused to comply, jailed her for 5 days. Her sin was she wore pants instead of a dress, which was improper and an affront to the legal system during that time. This was in the 1930s. I mean, we look at how often you've seen patriarchal control over a woman, what they can and cannot cover, how they should and should not present, etc. We see the middle of the 20th century into even the 1960s, where an unwed teenager got pregnant and they would ship them off to a home for unwed teen. They would just literally take them out of social sight for shame. I remember when I was at a private Christian school in 1986, the superintendent's daughter was a student. She got pregnant and he was gone like the next day. He and his entire family were like wiped from memory. No one really spoke about it. They made some nebulous comment about how he has pursued other interests and we wish him well. But, you know, there's just a perpetual blushing and shame about sexuality. When I was in private Christian school, it was true love waits. There would be purity rings, usually focused on the female.
Yeah.
They would talk about purity, but women were considered the gatekeepers for sexual purity. So it was women, cover yourself. Don't show too much skin. One of the Christian colleges locally, they phrase it like this. They say, preserve the mystery.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, what this does is it shifts all of the responsibility for male attitudes toward female sexuality. It just shifts all that burden on the woman, right? And the man, well, she's the Jezebel,
the temptress,
harlot, has tempted him, kind of thing. And it's so monumentally dysfunctional. I was there. I think the satanic panic fed a little bit into that, because while we did see devil horns and satanic symbols in all of this, you know, lascivious stuff happening in the culture, my Christian fundamentalist background also saw what we called permissiveness. You know, they're having sex and they're not married. They're living together. They have more than one partner. They have same-sex partners. They're hanging from the chandelier in a cat suit with, you know, Ozzy playing in the background. It's the end of decency as we know it. The devil has taken over the culture. I mean, it was a nonstop warning about, I don't know, it essentially was a programming to distrust what might be natural, healthy desires, certainly curiosities about the sexual self. I say in my latest book, I say, you know, never, ever, ever, ever take sex ed from a church. I took sex ed at a church school. I left more ignorant than I was before they started the class. So
fair to say.
To the last part of your question, is it a political movement, a grassroots movement? The answer is yes. I think there are a lot of gears in that machine. And I think that there's a ton. I mean, you'll find the political movements who have weaponized purity culture. And I think you'll find genuine people who really do feel like they are children at the grassroots, fundamental, in-home level, who just operate with some very sheltered, cocooned, often destructive ideas. And you'll find the spectrum in between. And again, forgive my long answer, but I was trying to outdo Alice's long answer so that, you know, I wouldn't be outdone on the show tonight. So.
Hey, that is all right. I'll just put on the 1.5 when I'm listening to the podcast while I jog through the park. We're
He's
good.
Gonna play me at 1.5 speed. That hurts me.
I actually
that cuts
really
me
appreciate
deep.
the insights, because this is one of those things that is so prevalent and pervasive that it becomes sort of invisible. You know, it's the microplastics in the water that we're all drinking, and it has a meaningful impact despite the fact that it's hard to kind of trace. What can y'all say about the maybe political or widespread culture impacts that we see out of purity culture? I mean, things like marriage rights and the struggle for like trans protections. How are those impacted by, True Love Waits and some of these other programs? Is it fair to draw that line?
You go first this time, Seth.
I think, how much, if the church, if God, political organizations who have weaponized the name of God, whoever, if they can control the sexual self, they've got your whole life, right?
Sure.
They've got who you are, what your private thoughts, your desires, your life partner, your practices, what you do and do not accept or deem acceptable, the type of people that you hang out with or open your doors to or open your heart to. If they control the sexual self, they've got you. And they know this. I think there are a great many churches who have just decided arbitrarily that they get to stamp a brand of ownership on what you are, who you are, how you behave, what is and is not acceptable. And then that bleeds into this idea that, well, only this type of sexuality is acceptable. Only this type of marriage is acceptable. Only these sexual practices are acceptable. And we have seen that running rampant with these radical right-wing evangelical extremists. Here in the state of Oklahoma, we had elected officials, mostly freaking white men, pass without debate or discussion a draconian abortion ban. Essentially, a bunch of white cis hetero dudes, most of them Christian evangelicals, planted their ideological and religious flags inside the uteruses of 2 million Oklahoma women. Their excuse is, well, our God has already deemed what is and is not right.
Yeah.
And proxy, who should ever challenge us? I think that's wildly convenient. I think some people genuinely believe in what they say. And I think other people are simply out for control of the culture, and they know the power of weaponizing the name of God to do it.
Yeah, I think that that's very true. Religion does love to assert itself between the things that we desperately need. So if we can get God involved in our, kosher or halal foods or into our sexuality or anything else that we can't live without, then yeah, it becomes impossible to live without God.
It's a little creepy too. It's kind of a God likes to watch thing.
Yeah,
Like,
don't
God's
love
in
that.
the room, I mean, would you do this with Jesus watching? And I'm like, well, if Jesus watching, is it a threesome? Because that's a whole other conversation. So.
Yeah, he chose to be here. I didn't choose for him to be here. This doesn't feel like my responsibility.
This
He's
is
the
not
perv,
consent.
not me.
I did not consent for
No.
Jesus to be in the room.
No. I would concur with everything that Seth just said. The way I see it is I think that there's just a huge theocratic movement, and I think a lot of government has traditionally been theocratic, and I feel like there's my take on it is I think that humans are very uncomfortable with mystery and we're very uncomfortable with the unknown. And I think that belief systems that are based in spirituality give us a sense of meaning and of purpose, and they tell us why bad things happen and why we exist and what our function is. And I think because of that, a lot of people are very reluctant to live lives that are not faith-based. And I think that the belief systems that are already existing, I think the fact that they're long established appeals to the majority of people who are very distrusting of new things, which I think is a lot of people. And so I think that we see a very regular, certainly in American history, we see a very regular resurgence of theocratic leaning movements that want to adhere to more traditional gender roles that are biblically based and sex lives that are biblically based. And I think that what we're seeing now in this country is just the latest wave of trying to return to that having a God-led country. Like, I was very heavily influenced by dominionist theory in my early teen years, which is, God gave us this world to dominate, to rule and to govern, and that obviously we need our government policies to be in line with what the Bible says, otherwise we'll all burn forever in hell. And so I do think that what you said, Seth, about it being a mix of people who just want power and control and people who genuinely believe that they're trying to spare us all from eternal damnation. I think that there is a sincere mix of genuine believers and just power hungry people who have been on the top for a long time that don't want to let go.
Oh, it's funny. You and I were speaking, Alice, about, I'm trying to remember when this was, but how repression cultures never work.
Mm-hmm.
If you look statistically at the United States, for teen pregnancy, for porn use, even drugs and other sort of quote unquote taboos or forbidden things, they're most prominent in repression states.
Sure.
Bible Belt states, the southern states. I mean, I think it was the Mormon state of Utah that was #1 for porn use in the United States. You got Pornhub going, thanks Utah for making us #1 in Mormon country. Oh, sorry, there's my dog. But what happens is, and I think this is really, really part of the crux of the problem. Honey, I'm trying to do a show. I'm dog sitting for my daughter, my stepdaughter. Is that if you repress it, you create a forbidden fruit scenario where you're even more curious and desperate to find out what's under the clothes, what's under the wrapper, what's happening in the bedroom, what's behind the door. But you have not tooled them up with the information to understand what sexuality is and how it works. Then you have saddled whoever's going through these natural curiosities and desires with a shit ton of sexual shame. So they have the thought, they have the question, they have the fantasy, they have the desire, and then they are on their knees. Dear Jesus, please forgive me for these lustful thoughts. I am carnal. The man who has committed adultery, lust after a woman in his mind, has already committed adultery in his heart, right? So we're all adulterers. I mean, it's a monumental mountain of dysfunction. And I get letters, I get emails, I have phone calls, I talk to people from all over the world who are still saddled, who are still scarred by all of this damaging doctrinal stuff, the shaming and the ignorance and the bad information, etc., that came down the pipe. It branded them. And even now, even though logically they know it's fine, I'm fine, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, we're all consenting, we're all adults, live carpe diem. They know that logically. They still feel an echo of the shame they were branded with. They still feel that in their heart, and they wrestle with it emotionally every single day. It's real damage, and it should be addressed and fixed.